Hello, and welcome to God in Film, the podcast where a Christian and atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see if we can find any parallels with the gospel or any other Bible stories. I'm filmmaker and former costumed adventurer Giles Goff, and sadly, Phil can't be with us today. He's busy trying to teleport a telepathic tentacled being into the heart of Manhattan in order to bring about world peace, as you do. So instead, we have guest co-host.
Hi, I'm RS Teacher and godlike non-linear being, Natalie Miniker.
And today we're going to be looking at Watchmen, in particular the HBO TV series that is a direct continuation of the 1986 graphic novel rather than the 2009 Zack Snyder film. So, Snyder fans, I'm really sorry. You might be a bit disappointed on this one.
They're used to it.
Yeah, well, I expect they will be boycotting me and bringing about a social media campaign any minute now. We'll be looking at Dr. Manhattan's utopia on Europa and why it's so difficult to have a relationship with a non-linear being, whether it's Dr. Manhattan or, Jesus. Natalie, what did you think of this show?
I flipping love this show. I watched it when it first came out. I love the fact that it is like, okay, there's this massive, huge Hollywood movie, which was a very famous adaptation of a comic book. We're not going to make a sequel to that thing that everyone's seen. We're going to make a sequel to the book, which probably quite a few number of people have seen, and I love it.
Yeah, really gutsy. Like, we're going to make a sequel to a comic book that came out in 1986 and you're just going to have to deal with that. Do you know what I mean?
I also think you could watch that show having not read the comic or seen the film and have been okay. Like they drip in the information that you need. So I think you could watch it having never read the book or seen the film.
Yeah. They're very clever with their exposition, I'd say that. I think this show is perfect. I really do. I love the way that it has the guts to say, okay, the book was about nuclear annihilation, and we're going to make this one about race because deal with it.
And I have to say, I'm kind of embarrassed that this was the way I learned about the Tulsa riots. I'd never heard about them before.
This is the way a lot of us learned about the Tulsa Massacre.
Yeah.
The riots makes it sound quite polite.
Fair enough, yeah. Like, such an important event, and we never hear about it. And I think it's fantastic that this big budget sci-fi show is like, hey guys, this thing happened, it's deeply problematic, and we should probably talk about it.
100%. And now it's time to hear from a man who is nothing short of remarkable. As a child, he quickly learned his intellect far outstripped his classmates and even his teachers. At 17, following the somewhat suspicious death of his parents, he inherited all their wealth but chose to give it all away to charity so that he could demonstrate the possibility of achieving anything, starting from nothing. He then decided to retrace the steps of Alexander the Great, embarking on a pilgrimage of physical, mental and spiritual discovery. Today, he has attained that level of peak mental, physical and spiritual perfection. Many people call him Bangor's smartest man, but we just know him as Matt Heslop.
Hello, it's Matt here for another Matt's Facts. This time, we're talking about Watchmen. Watchmen was published in 1986 originally as a miniseries that ran through to 1987. Created by Alan Moore, originally Watchmen was meant to feature some very different characters. In the early 80s, DC acquired the rights to certain comic characters belonging to Charleston Comics, and that was originally what Alan Moore wanted to use. That was what he proposed for. But DC decided they'd rather have something original, and after much persuasion, Alan Moore actually agreed. So, to give a bit of a basis on what each character was originally based on, I'll go through the main. First up, the Comedian. Now, the Comedian was surprisingly enough based on the Peacemaker, with a little bit of Nick Fury added for when he first appears as an older gent. Rorschach was based on a Ditko character called Mr. A, as well as DC's The Question, whereas Night Owl was based on the Ted Kord version of Blue Beetle. Now, this was a very Batman-esque character at the time. The other big example is Dr. Manhattan. He's the main driving force between a lot of the things in Watchmen. And he was actually based on a character called Captain Atom, who was a very powerful, albeit not a scientist, but a military man who suffered a very bad experimental mishap. Now, when it was released, the thing which took it was it took recent events, threw them in the superhero genre and went, what happens if these had happened and caused other things not to happen? And thus we find ourselves in the Watchmen comics. Now, in this world, we didn't have the Watergate scandal, which is one of the big ones, and the United States won the Vietnam War, but it also looms on what's going on with the Cold War. Now, at this point, we're in the midst of it, in reality, but in the comic books, the country is edging closer and closer towards World War III with the Soviet Union. Now, Moore did the entire series in a 9-panel style, which is a bit different for the age, but he went into it with his classic groups and told a great story. Non-linear, so the plot would jump and time would jump, locations would jump, and it was how the story came together. It linked slowly bits back to each other, is what made it such a superb story. It was all these things together which made Watchmen such a great thing. It spawned several different spin-offs. There's been other comic book runs, animated things, even a TV show. The movie itself is superb. They took the same style and put it in. Even if Alan Moore didn't like it himself, which he's notorious for doing, I truly believe it is a superbly performed film. And for the main part, stays very true to its source material. The graphic novel has been listed in some of the 100 best novels of all time. Under certain lists, it was often said, and this was in a respective review, that Watchmen heralded the moment where comic books grew up. Moore did oppose this idea. However, there was a bit of truth in it. Comic books had always been quite lively and bouncy things. Yes, you had the odd dark storyline, but it did herald a time where comics went very dark and pushed the limits of what they could. A lot of comics took quite a dark turn for a few years after that. And a lot of people put that down to Watchmen and what Alan Moore accomplished. It was something we hadn't seen similar before, and it is truly superb. If you've not read it, please go out and read it. I won't spoil the ending, but I will say this. The ending to the film is very different to the ending of the book. That's all from me, and I'll speak to you all soon for another Matt's Facts.
So Nat, those were Matt's facts. What did you think?
I am just always astounded at the depth of that man's knowledge. He is a walking Wikipedia article about comic
100%.
books. I found it really interesting about how it was originally, it wasn't meant to be original IP, that it was actually using existing characters, and then they changed that. And I found it really fascinating how, like, the characters that Alan Moore created were kind of copying stuff that had already been there. Because when I think of Watchmen, I think of this as like astoundingly original idea, and it's funny to think how much of that is actually based on pre-existing characters, even if it, they change the names and the details.
Alan Moore's a funny one, isn't he? So Alan Moore, for those of you that don't know, if we haven't talked about it, if you don't remember what we mentioned it in our Constantine episode, he has a tendency to completely and totally disregard any adaptations of his work. If you look on the credits for the show, it'll say based on characters co-created by David Gibbons. And I almost feel a bit sad for him, because this show is as close to perfect as I feel you're going to get. And it's like, dude, you're missing it. You know what I mean?
But I think with Alan Moore, if you look at some of the earlier adaptations of his work, so League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, famously terrible. From Hell got turned into a Johnny Depp film. I've read. I don't know if you've read From Hell. It is like trying to read the phone book. It is gigantic, and it is. Apart from the fact it's about Jack the Ripper, bears only the slightest resemblance to the movie.
Right.
So many of the things that he has written have been done terribly. And then when they started doing them well, it's like I think he just kind of just had dismissed the whole thing. Because V for Vendetta was actually the very first comic book I read, and then I read Watchmen straight
was
afterwards.
it?
Yeah, I got into comics quite late.
Yeah. Didn't I borrow Watchmen off you?
I think so. Yeah.
It was one of those things that I remember reading it. I'm not entirely clear how and when I read it, I absolutely hated it.
Really?
Yeah, we had a conversation about this, and I loved the Zack Snyder film, and I hated reading the book because I think that there's like so many things. I was quite sweet and innocent when I was younger. I don't think I was ready to read it at that point. Also, as you say, it's so dense as a novel. There are a lot of times when it will take a detour and be like, hey, look at this thing about a black freighter, and you're like, okay, I'm desperately hoping for the relevance. I think the thing that struck me is obviously one of the key themes about it is the countdown on the doomsday clock, to the countdown to nuclear annihilation, and there is a real sense of nihilism in the book and in the film. I think you'd probably agree. And for me, I feel like I can deal with that sense of cynicism and nihilism for the 2-hour window that it takes me to watch a film.
Yeah.
But when it's over a protracted period of time to read a, let's be honest, quite a thick graphic novel, it's quite burdensome. It does wear you down a bit. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I get that. I guess it depends a lot on how your literary tastes lean. Because I've always leaned towards more sort of darker, grittier, kind of depressing stories. And so when I read Watchmen, and bearing in mind it was like the second comic book I had ever read, I was like, I like this. I had no idea that comics could be as deep as that. Up until then, my only real interaction with comic books had been, the Beano and the Dandy when I was a kid, showing my age a bit there.
That is a big jump there to go from like Desperate Dan to Ozymandias.
Yeah, Dennis the Menace to the Comedian. I mean, there's a those two characters
are heavily linked, aren't they? The Comedian is basically Dennis the Menace, but with more guns. Now it's time for Finding the Faith in the Film.
I was working on that. I can workshop some different ones for you if that wouldn't work.
You better. You just
okay.
I need you to get really good at this really quickly, okay?
Okay. I'll do next one with more tassels. There you go.
So obviously, I think this TV show is damn near perfect, which is quite a shock because Lost was a bit of a mixed bag, which was one of the things that Lindelof ran, and The Leftovers, I just thoroughly hated every minute of that show.
Not seen that one.
Yeah, you're not missing anything.
Okay.
So, firstly, I want to look at the presentation of Olympia, effectively, the sort of little world that Dr. Manhattan creates on Olympia, the moon of Jupiter, where it's this beautiful sort of stately mansion, and it's sort of this kind of idyllic world, and it's populated by these two characters. I should say this was filmed in Penryn Castle, which is in my hometown of Bangor.
Big up Penryn Castle!
Absolutely. Do you remember we went there once?
Yeah, it was brilliant. I drove past it a few weeks ago when I was up in Bangor, and I was like, yay, Penryn Castle.
So, if we look at Adrian Veidt, aka Ozymandias, in his castle on Olympia, we can see a man who is surrounded by people who are not quite people. What's interesting is that this world is created by Dr. Manhattan for the benefit of Adrian Veidt, and there's two things that I think are interesting here. Firstly, one could argue that this is a version of the Garden of Eden. There's direct references to I created my Adam and my Eve, but it's created by somebody who is cynical of God and who doesn't trust his intentions. So these characters work to a script, they enact roles written by Veidt, and he disposes of them as he sees fit, in some cases just for his own entertainment. Now, I don't want to say that this is an atheist view of God, because I think that's a huge generalization. However, it is a really good example of what is God without love, And we could have a discussion about whether creating beings for your own personal reasons, e.g. your own happiness, is ethical or not. But to be frank, I think the metaphor on this one breaks down fairly quickly, because the creator of this world and the ruler of this world are two very different people, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Because didn't Dr. Manhattan created it for himself first, didn't he? And then realised it wasn't exactly what he wanted or intended, and kind of just handed it over to Voight.
Well, he said that they were too caring. They said that they were too caring. All they wanted was to love him and to serve him, and that got tiresome after a while, which really sort of links straight into why God gave us free will. Do you know what I mean? You can only really have a relationship with somebody if they have the option to say no to you at times, or to disagree with you at times. If they're just agreeing with you and sort of bowing and scraping all the time, it's not a relationship of equals.
This Garden of Eden and this kind of malevolent God, I do kind of see where you're coming from with that. Yeah,
100%. And the second thing I want to point out is that Lindelof said in a podcast interview that Dr. Manhattan is actually quite a boring person. What I mean is his personality is quite boring, you know? He's not particularly graced with creativity. Voight tells him that he has a profound lack of imagination.
Yeah.
And we do see that here, because when given the chance to create an entirely new world, one that has the potential to be utterly idyllic, essentially his own utopia, the first thing he does is pick a memory from his childhood and just populate it over and over again with two people who were nice to him.
So hang on, you're saying that like a perfect idyllic world is not North Wales?
No, I mean that is demonstrably true in so many ways. But what I'm saying is that he's just kind of done like Command C, Command V for humanity, and he's just kind of copied and pasted all over and over.
Yeah, I mean, down to the people, because the two people are based on the couple that were
the couple
nice
he
to
meets
him
as a child, yeah. And I found that absolutely fascinating, because what you saw in that, when you like, the negative image, if you like, of that is when we look at the world that we live in as it is, if we viewed it through the lens of it being created by a higher being that I'm going to call God, then I think we can see just how creative and imaginative that higher being must be, you know? God, as seen through his works, is like infinitely diverse, complex and gratifying. I mean, yes, we could all just look exactly like each other, have no real personality to speak of, but I think we can see how not only how dull but dangerous that could be. The thing I love about this is that God is basically a nerd, you know? He's like, look, I created this thing, and do you see how it works? And I've got all these different species to it, and it's this one does this, and this has this variation. It's the heart of a really passionate creator who is just desperate to show off everything he's created. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, that, because obviously they're trying to make a kind of Garden of Eden parallel, but I think you're right in that with Dr. Manhattan, like with God, do you know the phrase ex nihilo? So God creates things out of nothing. But I mean, Dr. Manhattan, I suppose, can he actually create matter? Or is he just rearranging it? But either way, you're right, like, because he is just cutting and pasting from stuff that he's already seen. In Genesis, it does say that humans are created in God's image, and I don't know, like, Dr. Manhattan is technically human, and he creates some humans.
Yeah, but he doesn't create them in his own image, though.
No,
does
that's
he?
true, because they're not blue.
You know, I'd have to say probably in terms of narrative conceits, Dr. Manhattan probably has to be the biggest narrative conceit of all of literature, where somebody has an accident at like a nuclear testing facility and they become a god. You know, like turning green and getting really strong, I could believe, you know, getting the proportionate strength of a spider. Yeah, I can get that. But being able to transport yourself to a moon of Jupiter and just create something out of nothing, you're like, okay, taking a lot on faith here, but okay, you know?
Yeah. With Dr. Manhattan, he does love, like, because in the original comic, that's why he leaves Earth. It's like he gets his heart broken, and I think he's not very demonstrative in that love, but he does feel it. And if you look in the Watchmen TV series, he has everything that he does with what's her name?
Angela.
Thank you. With Angela, yeah, it's all about he loves her and he falls in love with her, and he falls in love with her as Dr. Manhattan and then kind of becomes human. But I think with the difference is that his love is very much focused on just one person at a time. It's a very human love. Whereas if we're talking about him as being a god, God's got infinite love for all people. He's on. I think Dr. Manhattan he's omnipresent, I guess. He exists in time. He's omnitemporal, I guess we'd say. He's basically omnipotent, but I don't think he's omnibenevolent. His love is selective. He doesn't have godlike love. He's got human love still. So he's not quite the sort of god of classical theism, I guess.
And I think that's fascinating because it shows that for all the things he can do, for all the abilities that he has, he's actually so much closer to human than he is to God. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is if we look at this sort of role of Olympia where it's this idyllic place where everybody simply agrees with everybody else and there's no real variation to speak of. That's how a lot of people can sort of see heaven. Now, obviously, the Bible is really light on details when it comes to describing what heaven is actually like. So it seems reasonable that people have to try to fill it with their own imagination. And I think when we're doing that, it's important to also factor in the sheer amount of creativity God will put into it. We just can't imagine how it would be. And as a result, when people describe heaven to others, it does end up sounding quite dull sometimes. And I think that is a flaw of the person trying to get that across rather than heaven itself.
You know, in some of the readings I've looked at and sort of different theories and theologies and stuff, is that heaven is essentially just being in God's complete presence. And because God is beyond human understanding with our stupid meat brains, like, we cannot understand what that's like. And hell is therefore just the complete absence of God. So like the fire and pitchfork stuff is kind of missing the point. That's not the torture, it's being away from God's presence. And I guess, you know, the physical life that we have when we're alive is a kind of a middle ground, I guess. Yeah,
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Not bad for an atheist, eh?
Yeah. Just so we're clear, everybody, Nat wanted to make it very, very clear to everybody that she's definitely an atheist.
I did say that earlier on, don't worry. I'm the token atheist.
I don't think they'll kick you out of Atheist Club just for being on my podcast, you know?
Oh, damn it. I've got Richard Dawkins on the phone. Oh, damn.
Ricky D.
I've got to block his number. He keeps pestering me. Honestly, he is one of those guys who... I kind of agree with what he says, but I'm like, dude, there are better ways to say things. If you're trying to convince people to your point of view, don't insult them and call them stupid. Like, I teach my year sevens this.
He's I think he's our secret agent, if I'm honest. You know, I think.
Oh my God, he's a Christian sleeper agent.
I think he's a sleeper agent. You know, I think he just goes around screaming at people, "There is no God," and people who are so offended that they that he's talking to them like that, they actually start to take a contrary position out of pure spite.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly. It's the whole, you know, sun and the wind. You know, remember that analogy? Like, you try and. Do you not know that one? At the risk of going off on a tangent, I'll tell you this, you can always edit it out. It's a little parable that one of my teachers taught me when I was in primary school, and it always stuck with me, that if you're trying to convince somebody to change their mind and embrace your point of view or your way of life, something like that, you want to be like the sun and not the wind. So the parable is there's a man walking down a road, and the sun and the wind are up in the sky, and the wind says to the sun, I bet you, I'll make you a wager, I can get that man's coat off him. And so the wind blows and blows and blows and blows. And every time the wind blows, the man grabs his coat and pulls it to him tighter and tighter and tighter. And eventually the wind gives up. And then the sun goes, okay, now it's my turn. And the sun just shines and is hot and warm and sunny. And eventually the man takes his coat off by himself. And I always take that parable, that little story, it's not a religious one, just a sort of folklore tale, that it's like, if you want people to come to your way of living, like if you believe that your way of life, whether it's Christian, atheist, whatever, is the best way to be, then if you attack people, if you're like the wind and you just attack people and say, no, you're wrong, you need to do what I'm doing, people will grab onto their beliefs even tighter and they won't want to let go of them because they'll feel under attack. But if you just shine, if you just live a good life and you are a walking example of, well, actually, do you know what? This is my particular way of life, and look, I'm a good person and I am here just shining, then people may of their own free will come to your side. I don't know if it works, but it's always something that I have in my mind of, like, when you're trying to get someone to agree with you, if you attack their beliefs, they just hold on to them tighter. But if you just set a good example of, being a good person, it might be more convincing.
I feel you just summed up the entire raison d'etre of my podcast here, All I'm trying to do is I'm just this one guy looking at all these films going, look, there's God here and there's God here. Look, isn't he great? So, yeah, that's basically what I'm doing.
But yeah, Richard Dawkins, he is too much wind, not enough sun.
Mm-hmm. So the last thing I want to talk about is the 8th episode, A God Walks into a Bar, which is brilliant.
Best episode. Love that one.
It really was.
Wibbly
And the
wobbly,
reason I love this...
timey-wimey.
Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey. The reason I love this episode so much was it really showed how tricky it can be to have a relationship with a non-linear being. So we have, I'm going to call him Cal for this bit because he has at least 3 names. I'm going to call him Cal for this for distinction. He has that brilliant line where he says, I don't experience the concept of before. And there's that brilliant scene after she's brought him back where he's standing on the swimming pool. And he's saying, I'm going to talk to your grandfather. And there's that bit where he's like, I'm talking to him now, relatively speaking. And he says to the grandfather, I'm talking to her now, relatively speaking. And there's that moment where she says, how did you know that Judd Crawford was Cyclops? And then there's that bit with, who's Judd Crawford? And he tells him again, he doesn't know who Judd Crawford is. He does now. And there's that moment where she's going, oh my gosh, did I start this? Am I the starting point? And this is an absolutely fascinating example of a bootstrap paradox. Nat, just quickly, do you want to explain what a bootstrap paradox is?
So it's where you end up with a closed circle of continuity where it appears that there's no beginning or end. And it's called the bootstrap paradox because it's the phrase, lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps.
Yeah. Pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps is obviously ridiculous because you would still be pulling yourself up and you are still lifting your own foot in that case. Which I love anything which explains a time travel concept and also manages to smash a little bit of capitalism thoughts in there, because that's brilliant. It actually originates from something called Munchausen's trilemma, which is this old sort of allegory about Baron Munchausen, who is stuck in a swamp and he's trying to pull himself out of the swamp by pulling his own hair. It's like, well, that's obviously impossible to do. So yeah, you're right. It's that idea of something that's an impossible thing to do with a causal loop, if you like, And I was thinking about examples of Jesus doing this in the Bible, which are quite subtle, but they are there. So in Luke 4 verse 14, Jesus has sort of gone back to Galilee. He's sort of gone back to his hometown, and then it's a Sabbath day, so they're at the synagogue. And I'll read this next bit out to you. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everybody praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." So all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from him. So another translation of that is, as you were hearing that, this prophecy came true. Okay, because he's quoting Isaiah at that point. I'll have to look for the exact thing. Now, if we're looking at this on a surface level, or if we were trying to present Jesus as some kind of con man, we'd simply say that Jesus memorized these verses and used them to try to convince people he was a Messiah. However, if we take the view that Jesus actually is the Son of God, then something much more interesting is happening. So if you believe in the Trinity, then you believe that there's quite a porous nature between God the Father, God the Holy Spirit, and God the Son. So that's not a distinction that comes up in the Old Testament. It's not really something that's talked about in Judaism. It's a very monotheistic kind of culture. And as a result, there's no kind of distinction made there between who's doing the talking. You know?
Yeah.
So when one of the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah says something to the effect of, "The Lord said to me," or "So saith the Lord," or whatever you want to call it, it's tricky to pin down exactly who is doing the talking at that point. Is it God the Father? Is it God the Holy Spirit? Or is it Jesus? And, is there any real difference? So effectively, what I'm asking is, when he reads this out, is he basically quoting himself?
That's interesting. So if Isaiah is, if the Holy Spirit was talking through Isaiah when Isaiah was writing the prophecies, and then Jesus, if he isn't like a Dr. Manhattan non-linear being, he is kind of having that conversation in the past with Isaiah at the same time? Maybe.
Basically, yeah, that's kind of where I'm going with this.
Yeah,
is he saying this to Isaiah, anticipating the moment where he is going to be at the synagogue teaching to people? That's what I always found fascinating, that concept,
Yeah. No, I mean, if God is an omnitemporal being and exists in all places at all times, then yeah, he would be simultaneously with Isaiah and in the synagogue at the same time.
And I love that. And there's another interesting example, not showing the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament like this one, but showing the connection between the New Testament and all the centuries of Christendom that have come since, including today. It was touched on by one of the speakers we had at church recently, called a fellow called Duncan Fairbanks. I'll let him explain it.
And you've got to understand, at this point, Jesus has been hung on a cross. And now Jesus was back and alive with holes in his hands, talking to them. And he says to them, of course you believe, because of what you see, because of what you hear. You can see the holes, look, sunshine all the way through. You can see it. But then he says something that isn't for the benefit of his disciples 2,000 years ago, but it's meant for you. Because you've seen me, you've believed. Of course you do. But he says, look, blessed are those who have not seen, but you still believe.
So that last line there, that last verse 29, then Jesus told me, because you have seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. On a surface level, it could be him saying, yeah, of course you flip and believe me. You you can see the hole in my hand. You can see the sort of the thing in my side. You believing that I'm the Son of God isn't that big a deal. But also, to me, it is much more powerful to think of it in terms of Jesus knows that somebody is going to write this down, that John is going to write this down, and that this piece of information is going to be relayed to me 2,000 years later, and to all the sort of Christians since. It's one of those moments where somebody is speaking. Do you ever have that thing where a character is speaking to another character in a play or a film or something, and you're thinking, wait, hang on, that's actually a direct message for the audience.
Yeah.
Like, this is practically a moment where Jesus is more or less turns to the camera and says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe.
Jesus breaking the
That's you
fourth
guys.
wall in the
Breaking the
Gospels there.
fourth wall.
Little
Yeah.
Fleabag nod to the camera there. Yeah.
And I love that, you know, I love the idea that he knows as he's talking to people, he knows that the words are going to echo through the centuries, and sometimes he's talking not to his primary audience, but actually talking over their heads to the secondary audience, you know?
Yeah. Louder for those in the back.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some other really fascinating concepts there, like do you remember the bit where she says, well, if you're Dr. Manhattan, just prove it. Can you glow or something? And he says, well, I could do that, but I'd rather not until you agree to go to dinner with me tomorrow night.
Oh, we've all had that chat-up line used on us.
But what I found interesting there was Cal wanted her to believe in him rather than know without any doubt that it's him. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it's
You
like
know,
believe and then you will see.
Yeah, that emphasis on faith there. You know, the other thing I found obviously fascinating, and another sort of key parallel, in order for Cal to have a relationship with Angela, he needs to limit himself. Do you know what I mean? And can you remember how he does that?
He has that ring put in his head, doesn't he, that Adrian Veidt made for him. And it kind of makes him forget that he's Dr. Manhattan.
That kind of little inhibitor sort of put into his head, and the idea that was designed like 30 years ago, and that was plan A, and trying to sort of make him explode was plan B and all that sort of thing. So the idea is that Cal has this inhibitor put into his head, and it will make him forget who he is and forget what his powers are, because we're shown earlier in the episode just how unworkable it is to have a relationship with somebody who knows the entirety of your future together. Do you know what I mean? So similarly, Jesus, as the Son of God, as God himself, he sort of needs to limit himself, you know? And we know that human beings cannot physically withstand being in the presence of God with their human bodies. The idea is if you actually saw God, it would kill you, because it would just be too much. Like Moses sees like a bit of his back, and that ends up with his face absolutely glowing. So it's physically impossible for like God and humans to be in the same space at the same time. So what Jesus does is he makes himself human. We're drifting very much into Gilesian headcanon here, because I like the idea from Dogma that
I was just going to mention that.
that Jesus doesn't actually know that he's the Messiah. He doesn't actually know that he's the Son of God for his first few years of being a child, because it's too much, because he's willfully limited himself. For a set period of time, he has packed himself into a smaller body, a smaller vessel. They talk about it as like the tunnel of love, like there's these 10 years that they don't know what's going to happen. And I like the idea that Jesus just for a short set period of time, he doesn't know what's going to happen, because could he have picked Judas as his disciple, as his apostle, if he'd known that Judas was going to betray him? You know, I don't think he could have done it.
It's interesting. You talk about that as being Giles's headcanon. Actually, you're mirroring some big theological debate that I actually teach as part of the A level.
Thank goodness. I get worried with Gilesian headcanon, because the ideas I'm going to get onto are pretty freaking big, and I could really do with some backup on them, you know?
So have you ever heard of the phrase hypostatic union?
Well, I mean, obviously I know what hypostatic union is, but why don't you explain it for the listeners, just in case?
So the hypostatic union is basically the concept that Jesus is 100% fully human, but at the same time 100% fully God. So it's a concept you're probably familiar with. You just didn't know it had a fancy bit of terminology attached to it. So Jesus is 100% God, because he is part of the Trinity. Well, he is God, because the Holy Trinity, but he's also, when he's Jesus, he is 100% fully human. So Jesus wasn't just like some spectral figure who looked human. He was human. He slept, he ate, he had emotions, he felt pain and stuff. And that's important, because if Jesus didn't feel pain, then his sacrifice on the cross wouldn't really have meant much. Exactly. Yeah. So the question is, if you have this belief that Jesus is 100% fully human and also 100% fully God, what about when he appears to not know things? So, for example, when he's walking through the market and there's somebody touches his robe, it was the woman who was bleeding, I think it was, touches his robe, and he goes, "Who touched me?" So the question is, if he is 100% God, then he's omniscient, so he knows who touched him. So him asking that question is basically him play acting for the crowds. On the other hand, you've kind of got the argument, like basically what you were saying, that God willingly emptied himself of some of his power when he became Jesus, and that is a concept called kenosis. So this idea that Jesus willingly, when he became human, emptied himself of some of his his abilities, if not his godliness. He's still 100% fully God, but like willingly limited himself, kind of in the way that Dr. Manhattan does. So with Dr. Manhattan, he's limited his abilities and his awareness, but the idea is with Jesus, he knows he's the Son of God, but he is kind of turned down the volume on like the omniscience and stuff like that. Yeah.
So the way I imagine it is the human brain is like a 500 megabyte thumb drive, and you've got 18 terabytes of information that needs to go in there. You literally can't fit it all in. So Jesus learns about God the way the rest of us learn about God. Jesus learns about things the way the rest of us learn about it by sort of God talking directly to us, you know? Because again, you're right, he couldn't have all that information put into his head all the time. It would be impossible. It'd be exhausting, you know?
Yeah.
And I wonder about this concept of God limiting himself, whether it can be spread any wider. So you know about Calvinism, don't you? So Calvinism is the idea that it's the number of people that will be saved by God is predetermined. There are some people who are elect, there are some people who aren't. Basically, I'm not a big fan of it because I've never met a Calvinist who doesn't think they're elect, you know? So it's like, okay, fine.
Calvinism, it's an interesting one, because I think on a logical level, it's the denomination that makes the most sense in terms of like pure hard logic. Like if God is omniscient, he already knows who's going to be saved. And so that it makes sense on like a nice logic level. However, it's like what is the point then?
It is the Richard Dawkins of Christianity.
Yeah, it's like
when
STEM people try to do theology, you end up with Calvinism, and it's like where's the omnibenevolence? It's like you've made it all nice and neat and tidied up with a nice logical bow, but where's the love?
Yeah. So my theory, and this is Gilesian headcanon, please take this with a pinch of salt, but I believe, or at least I think, that maybe God has limited himself in order to have a relationship with humanity. That for the time that humanity has existed, he's decided to not know whether somebody's going to accept him or reject him. Because if God is love, he's not going to be able to create somebody knowing that they could reject him and all the things that would come with that. That's not consistent for me. But also, if he then only created people who he knew was going to love him, that then brings into question issues about free will. Do you know what I mean? For me, I think that God has deliberately limited himself. There are some beliefs that God can forget things, that he has like a selective memory, that he can, when you ask for forgiveness of a sin, God will not only forgive you, but he will forget that thing ever happened. You are completely new in his eyes. Do you know what I mean?
No, I was just going to say, I think it's something that pops up a lot in religious studies. When we look in year 8, I do a module with the kids about, does God exist? And we look at things like omnipotence and omniscience and the paradoxes that presents. And this idea that if you limit any of God's characteristics in any way, then you make him not God. So if you take away some of his omniscience, and he like you said in your Jarlesian headcanon, that God limits his omniscience so that he doesn't know who's going to be saved and who isn't. There is an alternative way out of that. This idea that, well, if God knows everything that's going to happen, he knows who's going to be saved and who isn't, how does that equate with free will? The argument is that just because you know something's going to happen, it doesn't mean you made it happen. So, like, the analogy is, imagine you're standing on a hill and you can see a mile away there's somebody has got their foot stuck on a train track, and there's a train coming. You know that person's going to get hit by the train, but you did not make it happen. And so the argument is that God can see everything that's ever going to happen, because he exists at all points at all times, but that doesn't mean he made it happen. I think it's an interesting. I don't know if it holds up to close scrutiny, but it allows God to maintain his omniscience and humans to maintain their free will.
Yeah, when you have free will and omniscience and omnipotence, then it really does create a few head scratches. The way I like to think of it is that God is in a 3-legged race with humanity. Okay, so I imagine if it came to it, you could probably be a bit quicker than Edith, your youngest daughter.
It depends if she's like grabbed something she's not supposed to and is legging her to a bedroom before I can grab her.
But my point is that if you took an adult and strapped their leg to a child, they're not going to be able to run as fast. They will still be able to run, but they won't be able to run as fast. And at any point, you could just take the straps off. You could just untie the thing. But you're choosing not to. And so you're accepting that limitation upon you in order to run at the same pace as somebody else. And that's the metaphor that works best for me when it comes to understanding God. That not only does he love us, not only does he want to do everything for us and to sort of keep us safe and keep us loved, he's also deliberately lessening himself, deliberately limiting himself in order that we could even begin to have a relationship with him. See what I mean?
Or could you not just argue, I mean, this is a phrase we tend to use a lot, particularly at A level when we get into the sort of deep theology about Christianity, is that there are many things that are, and there's a hand gesture that goes with divine mystery. You have to kind of like twinkle your fingers in the little rainbow, because you could say, well, God is God. God is so far beyond human understanding that our stupid meat brains can't even comprehend. So somehow that we can't understand, God can have that personal relationship with us while at the same time being omniscient and omnitemporal and all these things. And God can do it because he's God, and we are not God, so we shouldn't worry too much about how it happened.
Yeah, I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head. Like, don't worry too much about it. Like, have fun thinking about it, but don't let it get you stressed out.
It'd be like trying to explain quadratic equations to ants. Like
it'd be like trying to explain quadratic equations to me.
I use that as an example because it's been a long time since I did them, and I always remember them being really hard.
Fantastic. That brings us to the end of Finding the Faith in the Film, and that brings us to the end of this episode. Nat, have you had a good time?
I have had a wonderful time. I always love coming onto this show, and I think it's been quite interesting coming into this episode cold, because I am a planner and I like to know what I'm going to say, and it's kind of been quite scary freewheeling it, but I hope I brought some big knowledge bombs.
Well, I did realise what I was asking of you by saying you don't need to plan anything, it's totally fine. And I think the fact is that even with absolutely nothing prepared, you're still absolute dynamite when it comes to the knowledge bombs. Okay?
Why, thank Thank you. But yeah, thank you for inviting me on. I always love coming on this show, and any excuse to talk to Giles, I will jump on that.
Awesome sauce. All right, listeners, if you have been, thanks for listening, and we hope to see you next week for our Wakanda Forever episode. See you then. Bye.
Bye, 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 bye.
Gordon Film is hosted and created by Giles Goff. That's me. Mixing and editing by Giles. Our logo was designed by
Julie Walsh.
And our theme tune was composed by
Rick Lee.
Fact checking and waffle editing by literally no one. I've gone drunk with the lack of oversight. Guardian Film is a Dash production. Please rate and review, unless it's a 1-star, in which case, write your thoughts down in a blank and send it to us via blank, and we'll give it all the care and consideration we gave to writing these credits. Sorry guys, writer's block gets us all sooner or later.